All right. Welcome, everybody, to the evening session of Affirmation. I want to thank you all for being here. This is going to be a great evening. Laurie Lee and I will be occupying this space, and so if you can't see through me because I make a better door than a window, then you may want to sit a little over here because there will be some fantastic pictures, especially during Laurie Lee's presentation. We want to start this portion of our affirmation by just having a centering activity. And I've asked Sarah Isaacson if she would come and spend just a couple of minutes and talk about the experience that she had at Feed My Starving Children and doing some community building last night in our activity.
Well, thank you, Nathan, for letting me do this. Affirmations has been an amazing place for me to grow. I really felt like I lost a large part of my life in my transition. I had my family kind of push me away, and the church kind of pushed me away. And Affirmation was a place that I could come and get help and get support, and I'm really thankful for that. But then last night, we had a really fun time, and we went over to Feed My Starving Children, and what an amazing experience that was. It was my first time, and we weren't doing anything phenomenal. We were filling little bags with, it had rice, soy, some nutrition, and some vegetables in it. That's all that was in these bags. And so you weren't thinking much of it, it was just kind of a simply line approach, just fill a bag, move it over, fill a bag, move it over. And then when we found out at the end what we had actually done, we fed, I think it was 93 children, 104 children for a year with what we did in that one night. And we were there for an hour and a half doing it. So it was just absolutely phenomenal. And then we got to see just how big of an impact it actually does make on real lives, on people that just don't have enough to take care of themselves. We saw this 11-year-old boy who was taking care of his 3 younger siblings because his father was a drunk and had no interest in taking care of the family. And so his 2-year-old brother, when they first found the family, was just, looked like a skeleton walking, just absolutely disgusting, the situation they were in. And that was one of the families that this project was able to help. And they showed pictures of before and after, and just, they looked like healthy, happy young kids, even though it was an 11-year-old taking care of 3 younger siblings. It's just absolutely phenomenal what these people have to go through. And this program, as simple as it was, to just sit there and fill little bags of, simple foods, changed their lives forever. And it's kind of humbling to realize we got to be a small part of that. And so thank you for making that possible. And thank you, Affirmation, for being such an important part of my life. And so with that, I'll turn the time back over.
Thank you. Well, I want to give a special thanks to Ladder Gay Stories. That is transmitting our session tonight, and we'll make the link available for all of Affirmation to listen to this evening session of Affirmation Spring Conference here in Mesa, Arizona. I want to give just a brief overview of what is happening in Affirmation. Affirmation has a new executive committee, myself, Laurie Lee Hall, and Jairo Fernando Gonzalez Diaz. I got that right, from Colombia. And it is a remarkable team, and Affirmation is moving into some great spaces as we progress forward as an executive committee and as a wonderful, supportive board. I welcome you for being here today. Tonight, just for a few minutes, I want to just give you an idea on how I view leadership and just service within the organization. And usually people enjoy to hear a snippet about you in your past life before you came out. What was Nathan up to back 15 years ago? So, In 2004, actually it was 2003, I was in the church building walking down the hall, and a member of the stake presidency pulls me into the library for an interview. And no library interview is ever easy. And he said, Brother Kitchen, I want you to plan our Stakes Pioneer Trek. And this was back in the day before there was a Pioneer Trek manual. And he said, I have about a 5-6 page document from BYU, and I need you to make this a Trek experience for the youth in our stake, which turned out to be about 400 youth. And so I got to work, and I created committees. I created a wonderful experience. I can only equate it to producing and directing a mobile Hill Cumorah pageant up in the White Mountains of Arizona for 4 or 5 days. And in the end, it was amazing. We achieved the goals we wanted. People had experiences that they really kept with them through their whole life. And one of the things that you do on a trek is, in the original Pioneer Trek, the handcart pioneers hit a very hard part of the trail, which is called Rocky Ridge. And it was cold, it was snowy, and they were freezing. And they made it up Rocky Ridge in Wyoming. And so part of these treks, you mimic a rocky ridge where these handcart companies of youth together work to go up a side of a hill or a mountain in a way that they feel much accomplishment. And in the end, it's a team-building experience, and it's an experience that the youth take with them the rest of their life because they accomplished something that was very, very hard to do and seemed impossible. So this was back in 2004, and it was a wonderful experience. I would call it maybe one of the crowning achievements of my work in the church. So 4 years later, it's 2008, and my oldest son, Jonathan, had just turned 16, and he was eligible to go on the next trek. Our stake would do a trek every 4 years. That way that when you were a youth, you would at least get the trek experience once in your young men, young women's program. Well, Jonathan has autism. And things like outdoors, bugs, any unfamiliar food is very difficult. Flies, and walking. He has a difficult time walking and doing physical events. And I remember the Stake Young Men's president called me and said, hey, we want Jonathan to come. He'll be inspiring to all the rest of the youth. And I got thinking, do I want Jonathan to be an inspiring mascot for others, or does Jonathan deserve a trek for him? And so I said to myself, I know how to build a trek for 500 people. And this year, I am building a trek for 1. And so I thought, what would be best for Jonathan? Now, when Jonathan was a baby, he was nonverbal. And how Jonathan would communicate is he would learn the language of Disney movies, and then he would use snippets of those lines to convey what he wants. And so I turned out to be Mufasa, and he turned out to be Simba. And a lot of what we did was quoting Disney lines back to each other, and we could get what each other was saying. And it was quite endearing. And to this day, he still calls me Mufasa, and I call him Simba. But he has every single Disney movie memorized word for word. And so I knew for Jonathan, the most meaningful place to do a trek of 1 was in Disneyland. And so when I told the stake president that I was going to Disneyland for Jonathan's experience, that kind of went over like a lead balloon. But I remember we boarded the plane. I had created little note cards of just life experiences that I wanted to convey to Jonathan that would be meaningful. And I wanted Jonathan to have a Rocky Ridge experience, something that would be difficult, but something that would be meaningful for Jonathan. Now, Jonathan had just turned 16, and more than anything, he wanted to bless the sacrament. And so I thought, how are we going to do this? And I realized that when we would replay Disney lines back and forth, that he could memorize dialogue. And so in the days at Disneyland, we would trek through Disneyland and have a great experience. And at night, we would come home to the hotel room, and together we would work on the sacrament prayer. I said, Jonathan, do you want to do the bread or the water? Jonathan said the bread. And so I said, oh, why the bread? That's the longest one. But we worked on that. And so for 4 days, every night, Jonathan wanted so badly. And so I would read a line, and he would mimic it back to me. And we would go back and forth, and he truly wanted to memorize the sacrament prayer. And I remember one night we were there, and the word sanctify was very hard for Jonathan to say. And we spent probably 30 minutes working on the word sanctify. And so at the end of this trek, we got back home, and that Sunday, Jonathan knelt at the sacrament table, and he said the sacrament prayer for the bread. And as he put the entire congregation under covenant, I thought, how beautiful. When he stood, I realized that here was Jonathan standing on top of Rocky Ridge, and he had made the trek, and he had memorized the sacrament prayer for the bread. And that was important for him. And that was because we had a trek of one, and it was meaningful. So as I come to affirmation, I look at the same thing. I'm like, what do we need as an LGBTQ population right now? The world is different for us than it was for the LGBTQ population 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So as I and our REC look at what is next, what is ahead, we have to forge, and we want to create experiences that are meaningful for you as an organization. We don't want to just keep doing the same tried and true things. So here we were last night. We had made the top of Rocky Ridge together, and it was a great and just beautiful experience. Very quickly, affirmation, we're up to some very great things, and part of what we're doing is laying this foundation so that we can have the ability to have these kind of experiences that you need as an LGBTQ individual. One of the first things we did is affirmation had become unwieldy. And Laurie Lee Hall had a bout of inspiration, that's about all I can say, on how to now organize affirmation so that we can actually provide world-class support through the entire world. Affirmation is organized officially in 12 countries. We have a reach in almost every time zone. And that gets unwieldy as affirmation grows. Affirmation is growing leaps and bounds. We have people in the Philippines, in Hong Kong. They are messaging us, please, we need something. We have to be able to be up and mobile and move to make affirmation available for other people. Because there are a lot of organizations on the Wasatch Front that do wonderful things for the community, but in most of the world, affirmation is the only game in town. So we have created a way that we can support now chapter growth. And the other thing is as your organization grows and you have large budgets, you can't just have one big pot of money. And if you need it, you just go in and get money out, and hopefully money comes back in. And Jairo, being an auditor in Colombia, this was his deal. And he helped create the economic and financial policy for affirmation. And we have solid financial measures in affirmation, and we have solid resources, and we have solid boundaries that will keep us safe. Like any big nonprofit now, we've separated the accounting from the actual operations so that there are checks and balances for us to move forward. So I'm grateful for that. Affirmation is becoming extremely mature. And then lastly, in the past 10 years, affirmation slowly began to dissolve in the real world and move online. And moving online is a very difficult space to be when you are trying to provide support. The online world is not kind, and people tend to say things and do things because they're not looking or in the presence of another person. And so we started seeing affirmation was balkanizing. People were gathering in little groups And we were missing what the big, giant community feel of affirmation is. And so the board recognized this. And so we created, as a board, a strategic plan to bring affirmation back out into the real world. And this is our chapter development plan. We are rolling it out in the United States first, because the United States noticed the most chapter just dissolving as everyone went online. And so you may have been a member of affirmation at one point, and then all of a sudden there was no affirmation. And that's because everyone went online. We want to bring this back out, because when you're in a room as a gay man with the other letters, with the L's and the B's and the T's and the Q's and the I's and the A's, you have such a wide worldview, and you make so many friends, and you become just a better ally for the other letters. And I have met friends that I would have never met otherwise if we had not come together in person in affirmation. Now, the Bay Area just reorganized their chapter, and the president of the Bay Area chapter is Victoria Hutchings. And I was there for that chapter reorganization just a few weeks ago, and she gave me this. I mean, where else am I going to know this? She is a remarkable person. We sat in her home on Nob Hill in San Francisco, and she laid out the vision for what's going to happen in affirmation in the Bay Area, and it was electrifying. I can't do justice, so I want to play what the Bay Area affirmation, what their 4 desires for chapters are. And this really is the desire of affirmation. She literally nailed this on the head.
Okay, so here are our 4 things that we want this to be about, our 4 guiding impulses. And first off is Zion building. We want to put all of our talents. We all learned a lot. This church has taught us stuff. We have skills. We have network abilities. Let's try this out and do some good. And again, we want to be joy-centered. We want this to be fun and happy and good. Because I want the tiny people in our orbit to see that this life is really happy and legit and responsible and goodness. We want to keep everything queer and trans focused. We love our mom and Dad, but we're going to keep this here on us. And also, we're going to make sure we keep this intersectional. I want to make sure we have room for every kind of queer person and every kind of Mormon person. And a lot of that is going to require us to be better people, because we're really white in here. And so we're going to need to work on dismantling some racism, and we're going to need to work on becoming a lot less sexist, and we're going to be better people so that there is a wider circle in this room next year. We also are thinking about maybe doing something large in about a year, and so everyone should be in their back of their brains thinking about what they want to do with a whole bunch of queer Mormons.
This was so electrifying to hear Victoria lay out the vision for what the affirmation chapter is going to do in the Bay Area. So just to recap, the first thing she said is, we are really good as Mormons at Zion building. That's probably one way of also saying we are good at building a community. We can be in a room together, and in within 2 minutes, it's just dumb and stupid how fast we are friends. We all have that common experience, and we are friends. And building these communities, this is what we do for each other, is we create these supportive communities. And 2, I love that she said we are joy-centered. And we want to show those who are most vulnerable, who are maybe feeling a bit hopeless, whether they're coming out or the way they're intersecting with the church right now is difficult for them. We want to be able to show that this life has so much to offer. There's so much joy. There is so much wonder in the LGBTQ community, and there is so much support here. And then third, Affirmation was created by the community, and Affirmation is an LGBTQIA plus run organization. We are it. This isn't Ally Mutual. We are the ones who lead it, and we are the ones that have the vision, and we are the ones who patiently educate those around us to come along with us to our beautiful, wonderful, rainbow, glitter-filled world that actually brightens the entire world, because that is what we do. So we want to keep things queer and trans-focused here. And then last, keeping things intersectional. And really, there is a lot of whiteness in this room. We want to be sure that we reach everybody. And we also want to reach everyone on any way that anyone is intersecting with the church. Having a personal belief in religion is a wonderful thing if that is what you desire. If you have non-belief, that is excellent. And we have to stop being triggered with each other when we bring our personal beliefs into a space. It's like online comments. If you just don't agree with it, just scroll on by, because there are others who may agree with it or may provide support. It's not worth it for a community to continually tear each other down, because we are a community that's organized to go and do things. We are organized to help one another, and we're organized to make a great change in this world. And we can't do that if we are like little crabs in a tank, always just pulling each other down, and everyone is miserable together. So I just invite you, if you're in an area where Affirmation is not yet, we are trying to come to you. We are coming first to the chapters and areas in the United States, because that was the area that the board recognized needed the most help. And so we are in the middle of building 40 chapters. 33 chapters, excuse me. Thank you. 33 chapters. And so literally everyone will only be about 90 minutes away from a center of Affirmation if you live in the United States. And once we are done bringing these back and having chapters that are just like this, where you have a great supportive community, we're turning our attention down to South America. And then Laurie Lee Hall, her area that she is over is the area that needs the most growth. This is the Pacific. This is Asia. This is Africa. So we have places to go, and we want you to join us. As an executive committee, we can't do this forever. We want to retire and go with our loved ones and enjoy life. And we want to help grow a leadership so you can come and you can stand as an EC in a few years, and you can continue to lead Affirmation to these great heights, because change is coming, change is happening, and especially the generation that we are seeing that are starting to come out and transition in their 20s. This generation wants to port their beliefs with them, and they are refusing to let that go. And this is probably one of the first times in the history of LGBTQ LDS church intersection that this is happening. And so we want to stay on this crest, and we want to build something just like a trek. And we're not going to do a trek for one. We're not going to do a trek for 400. We want to do a trek for you. And so I'm humbled by serving in an executive committee. And I am very humbled now to introduce to you one of the most brilliant people that I have ever worked with, and that is Laurie Lee Hall. I got so excited about Laurie Lee that I need to tell you about two things that are happening. Come to our international conference. This is our flagship conference, and this is going to happen June the 21st through the 23rd. And here's where you will see everyone come together through all chapters in the world and be together as a community. And the second thing is the one that I am very excited about, and we are participating in World Pride this year. This is the 50th anniversary of Stonewall. And because of that, for the first time ever, the World Pride Committee chose to come to the United States to celebrate World Pride. And that's happening in New York City the whole month of June, but the march is happening Sunday, June the 30th. So I invite you to come. We were given one of the prime slots of the march, which was the first one, and we are an official partner with the World Pride Organization. And this is big, and I'm excited. I would love to have you come. I know that's the same weekend as Love Loud, and choose. Cordelia.
I'm just going to ask, are there going to be like members in New York who let us stay with them?
Contact me. We have many details, and it's on the website. If you need more information about this, go to affirmation.org. We have tiles that will show you how to register and what's happening at the International Conference, and a tile that shows you about World Pride. When you register, you will get a shirt that has both the World Pride logo and our logo together, and we're going to march through the streets of New York City and really show what our community is about. So I am grateful for that. Laurie Lee Hall. Laurie Lee was raised in New Zealand and in New England. I need some glasses. Laurie Lee Hall was raised in New England and was trained in architecture at the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in upstate New York. A practicing architect for over 30 years in New York and Utah, her career included managing worldwide design and construction programs of many of the largest projects of the LDS Church. Today, she maintains an architectural practice in Salt Lake City and in her newly adopted home of Louisville, Kentucky. Ms. Hall also served the LDS Church in several prominent leadership capacities ecclesiastically, but in 2017 was excommunicated from the church. She serves as the Senior Vice President of Affirmation, LGBTQ Mormons, Families, and Friends, and administrator of the Transactive LDS Facebook support group, and founder of the Families and Gender Variance Project, which I have to say is a very beautiful project. As a woman with transgender history, she has powerful life experience with family, communication, stages of grieving, and mindfulness. She has worked within her own family and with youth and adults to navigate the challenges and triumphs of living authentically. In 2018, this passion developed into the Becoming program at the Encircle House in Provo, Utah, for gender-variant youth and their families. Laurie's focus is to help families remain viable and successful, to foster dialogue, listening, and respect. She has blogged and written extensively on the subjects of gender variance and marriage and the intersection of gender and faith traditions. She and her partner Nancy are the parent of 9 children and 18 grandchildren. I am very proud to have Laurie Lee speak with us. She is a wonderful friend, and she is a force to be reckoned with in affirmation, and we are all glad to have you.
Daniel, is this working okay? Thank you. Good evening, everyone. It has been a wonderful day here at the combination of the Affirmation Spring Conference and the All Arizona Conference. And for those who've had a chance to hear all of the speakers today, I was thrilled, just thrilled to be a part of this and to sit on the front row and bask in the things that were being taught and said and the life stories that were being shared. And I'm grateful for this opportunity to offer some additional words that I hope will contribute to the spirit of this weekend and this conference. We also had a remarkable social gathering last night, wherein we were able to enjoy time to talk together and snack at the Woods home, my hosts for this weekend, and I'm grateful for them. We listened to Mindy Gledhill share her thoughts and some of her songs from her most recent albums that really speak to our heart and sense and feeling of faith transitions and life transitions and finding our authentic paths. And it was just a beautiful evening. And then, as Sarah explained earlier, we enjoyed that great service project at Feed My Starving Children. What a wonderful weekend this has been. So my responsibility tonight is to share with you aspects of my story that, frankly, I have never shared publicly before, and to connect some dots that have, over the last couple years, been kind of gelling and connecting in my mind, and I think are now percolated to the point where they can be served up, and as a sauce to see if y'all could enjoy this sauce. As mentioned in the introduction, and I was interested how much ground the introduction covered, to kind of bring you up to speed on some certain facts about me, that yes, I was a church employee for 20 years, the bulk of my professional career. Yes, I was an ecclesiastical leader for the bulk of my years as a church member. I think at one point I had served on a ward or a stake council in some capacity for 18 of my first 25 years as a member of the church, and presided over one of those councils for some 15 years. I served as a ward bishop. I served as a stake president. And a lot of folks, especially feminists, get real excited about the fact that I held the keys to a stake as a woman. Greg Prince had a few things to say earlier today about the importance of having women in our councils. And I'm grateful to fill that space in our executive committee and on our board of representing both the gender variant community and women in affirmation. So as I bring you up to speed in this new chapter of the story that I'm going to share tonight, I would refer those who are interested in my background to probably the seminal interview that I gave to Mormon Stories podcast almost just shortly after my excommunication. I sat down with John DeLynn in his office in his home and talked to his iPhone 7 for 5 hours nonstop, bringing the listening audience from my birth up to that point in time on a number of subjects. So if you want to know about my past, 770 through 773 of Mormon Stories podcast, and you can get the rest of the story. I purposely, in that interview, did not talk a great deal about my actual work for the church. That was intentional. That wasn't the point of that interview at that time. I'm going to talk more about that tonight. I am actually going to talk a little bit about the intersection, because in affirmation we really are about intersections between being LGBTQ and something having to do with Mormon heritage or practicing Latter-day Saintism. that intersection is a part of my story as well. And as I've been allowing this story to percolate, as I mentioned, I've come to realize that probably some of my greatest professional works happened simultaneously with the greatest work of my life, which was transitioning from who I was pretending to be to who I authentically am. And the fact that those occurred simultaneously, I lived through that, but I've not told that story. So we're going to talk about an intersection tonight of both aspects of my life that were going on at the same time, which in hindsight seem remarkable to me. In doing so, I am going to talk about things having to do with being in the LDS Church. As I look around the group tonight, I don't see anybody that's going to be too frightened by talking about the church. Sometimes in our conferences, things can get a little too churchy. I need to kind of frame where I am with regard to the church. People have often asked me, and particularly after my disciplinary council, people would say, well, do you have a testimony of the church? And I'm very stubborn. I will not answer that question because I think it's a really strange question. What do I mean? What does it mean to have a testimony of the church? I never worshipped the church. The church never became an idol in my life. The church was an institution, as I told John DeLynn, that was a vehicle that brought me knowledge of spiritual matters that I cherish in my life. But it wasn't something I particularly, as an institution, had a testimony of. Working for the church was complex, and some of that I'll explain tonight, and some of it no one will ever hear, how complex it was to work for that organization and see and do the things that needed to be done there. I don't have faith in an institution. I have faith in my heavenly parents. I have faith in the atonement of Jesus Christ. I have faith in the mission of the Holy Ghost. And those things which were part of who I was before I was introduced to the restored gospel, and which were greatly cultivated during my time as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, those things remain with me and could not be taken away by an administrative action performed in a stake office. People, including my middle daughter, who is a faithful, believing young member of the church, she asked me, Daddy, did you feel the Holy Ghost leave when you were excommunicated? And I said, Sweetie, no, I didn't feel that loss that we were always told about, and that I may have even been guilty of teaching sometimes in my former life. And so her question, and the question of many others who would ask that, caused me to think a great deal about what it means to receive the Holy Ghost, that invitation that we're offered at confirmation. And my conclusion, which relates down to where I am, was that in February of 1980, I was given the invitation as an 18-year-old college student to receive the Holy Ghost. And then I spent the next 37 years working to cultivate a relationship with that entity and to enjoy their influence in my life. And at some point along that journey, the invitation became moot, and the relationship remained, if I'm making sense, my relationship with the Holy Ghost. And so my experience, and I'll just tell you this as my own experience, no administrative action was able to change that relationship that I had earned, so long as I continued to live in a way that allowed me to enjoy that relationship. And so whether you call it the Holy Ghost, whether you call it energy or the forces of the universe, whatever you want to call it, I call it the Holy Ghost. that was a part of every aspect of my life. How I raised my family, how I performed ecclesiastical responsibilities, how I performed my professional duties. And I love this quote from Robert Millett, professor at BYU. And creative artists open themselves to the enlightening powers of the Holy Ghost and are imbued with the spirit and power of the restored gospel. Learning and discovery and creativity reach beyond the paltry bounds of what has been done heretofore and open us to new vistas of understanding and expression. And my experience, and some of what I'll share with you tonight in these images, from my professional side, represent things beyond my natural means that I had an opportunity to lead and direct and contribute to. There is beauty beyond what any of us as design team could have ever produced on our own. It was, from my experience, it was God-given. It was given through the gift of the Spirit. And I will present that and offer those images to you for your own digestion and satisfaction. Make of it what you will. I know that there are many people who consider the work that I did on temples to have been some of the greatest waste of tithing money ever known in the history of man. Be that as it may, there are some really beautiful things that were accomplished and created during that time frame. Whether the use of all the church funds was appropriate, that wasn't my role. My role was to do what I'm about to show you. But it was blessed through the Spirit because I and my teams were not as good as the results that God helped us to accomplish. And with that in mind, and if you believe that premise as I share it with you, I'll also share with you that at the same time, I was on a journey of personal acceptance and discovery, which some would say marked me as an apostate, marked me as someone who was dabbling in the occult or darkness, spending too much time reading things that I shouldn't have been reading and thinking about stuff that I shouldn't have been thinking about given who I was. But a journey of personal self-discovery and self-acceptance, and then ultimately acting upon what occurred that I believe was also God-inspired and given through that same gift of the Holy Ghost. So, if by their fruits ye shall know them, there's a body of work on the one hand, I'm a body of work on the other hand. The two occurred simultaneously under the direction of the same influence and the same positive spirit. What does that teach us about who we are in God's eyes and what we can do if we ourselves and accept ourselves and love ourselves and allow Him to work with us and offer Him our love and devotion through serving and loving each other and building community and doing all of these things? Where's the negative in all of this story? There isn't any. Now, unfortunately, administrative actions had to be taken, and I found myself in a place where I actually got what I wanted, which was to be able to worship God according to the dictates of my own conscience, and my own conscience told me that I was female. And so I can now worship God according to the dictates of my own conscience. And I'm glad for that. I didn't like being put out of an organization that I helped build. That felt egregious. But it's been balanced by an opportunity to come into an organization such as this one and provide just as much blessing and help. Nathan mentioned that I have the world, the old world, as my responsibility to grow affirmation, everything east of the U.S. shores and all the way back around to the West Coast, some 20 time zones where affirmation can grow. But that's not new to me, because the work that I did in church physical facilities for 20 years, it was kind of like the British Empire. The sun never set on temple design and construction. And there were literally projects going on in every face and every corner of the world, and I personally found myself visiting with the saints everywhere there were saints. On every continent. I've been a lot of places. So when I get an email the other day from a young trans woman who wants to build affirmation in the kingdom of Tonga, that doesn't freak me out, because I rebuilt the temple in Nuku'alofa, Tonga. That's familiar to me. Thailand, Philippines, Nathan mentioned several of these locations. I've been to all of those places. I've talked with the saints there. I'm excited to be able to take the organizational skills that I learned and that I practiced and used in church physical facilities all around the world and applying it now to building affirmation around the world. And I don't think it's coincidence that these things occur. So, the process that actually got Mindy to come to last night started with my discussion with Nathan about my assignment to teach tonight, to present tonight. And as he talked with me about the fact that he wanted me to talk about my professional work for the church and my transition, it started to gel in my mind how these two could intersect and come together. My mind went back to this quotation that Mindy actually posted of her own accord, without me even knowing that she was going to do this, on her Facebook site a couple months ago. And you can read it for yourself. I won't read it out loud to you, but it completely shocked me one day. I opened up my Facebook feed and I'd been tagged by Mindy, who is a good friend, but she wrote this lovely, stirring thought about the contribution of transgender people and used me as the example. As she lives on the bench in Provo, and she looks down literally from her front yard on the Provo City Center Temple and on the Missionary Training Center. Two projects that were accomplished during this time frame that I'm about to teach you about. And so when I wanted to give this presentation, I reached out to Mindy and I said, would it be okay if I use this quotation as kind of the basis for tonight's presentation? And she gave me permission to do that. And then she said, hey, is there any way I can come and participate and be a part of this conference? And that evolved into last night's just incredibly generous mini concert for us. So I've entitled tonight's discussion, Architect to Affirmation. Maybe that's a play on words. Maybe that's just my linear course through time, or maybe I am the architect of affirmation at this point. I don't know.
Yes.
Okay. But a few years ago, I put together this slide to kind of give a quick overview of some of the things that I had a chance to be responsible for as I worked for the church. There were a number of temples there. They'd be much smaller if I actually put a picture of all of the temples that I worked on there. Some 60 new temples, or temples that were rebuilt and rededicated during the years that I served as either the director of construction or the director of temple design, or both, and then ultimately the director of special projects design for the church between the years of 2002 and 2016. So just a remarkable cross-section of every building that the church, every building type that the church ever builds. And a lot of people don't realize that high-rise residential towers are something that the church does, the for-profit side, of course. Missionary training centers, visitors centers, historic sites, family history centers, seminaries, temples. I've done some of all of them. The church history library downtown, the Salt Lake Tabernacle. It's just amazing what I had the opportunity to do. Now, a brief word about what that assignment entailed in terms of my interface with the brethren. For a number of years, I interfaced directly with a number of general authorities responsible for physical facilities and for temples. And for 66 months in a row, over a course of 5 years, I reported directly to the First Presidency, the President Monson, President Eyring, President Uchtdorf First Presidency, with regard to the design and construction of temples. So on the second Thursday of every month for 66 months in a row, I went to meet with the First Presidency and selected members of the Quorum of the 12 and other general authorities and gave them a monthly update on the progress of temples under construction and the new design elements for upcoming temples. And they reviewed them in incredible detail, more than I would have ever imagined coming into the program. I gave a presentation to a group of middle-aged single adults in Utah once at a middle-aged single adult conference, and I stood up and I said, I'm going to talk about temples. And this wonderful, beautiful sister on the front rows looked up at me and said, "Well, what do you know about temples?" I said, "Well, give me a chance and I will show you." I actually knew something about them. So anyway, we're going to talk about some of these things tonight. After serving for a number of years in the Worldwide Meeting House Design Program that actually had me first on jet airplanes, training on processes and principles related to meeting house design and construction in places like Sao Paulo, Sydney, Tokyo, Manila, Hong Kong. Where else did I go? All over the United States. I'd already been around the world many, many, many times when the brethren asked if I would put together the processes on how to design and construct temples. And this was at the tail end of the big push to build the 45 small temples to get to the point of having 100 temples. And the department was in need of some kind of restructuring and grounding. In some ways, like Affirmation is at this point in time, an opportunity to kind of restructure and ground it with principles and then to move forward in a bold way. And so I started working in temple design and construction, which again put me back on planes and headed out all around the world. At that time, I was serving as bishop of our ward, and I learned to rely heavily on counselors who kind of did the day-to-day work in Tooele, Utah, while I was gone most of the time. This is the church office building in Accra, Ghana, that we had just finished constructing in Accra. And every time you see a group of white shirts and ties, I'm one of them. And so the game tonight that you can play is which one of those fat old white men in a white shirt and tie was me, or that person that I used to be, okay? So I'm not going to take a pointer. I thought about this. I thought, but I can take a pointer and show you which one's me. But nah, that's up to you. It'll keep your interest. So built the church administrative building in Accra, Ghana. Also on the temple site, as the Accra, Ghana temple was being built, it was really a wonderful thing to build those first two temples in Black Africa. There was already a temple in Johannesburg, but it was really, the white men's temple in Johannesburg. The neat thing was building in Accra, Ghana, and Aba, Nigeria simultaneously in West Africa, in the deep parts of Black West Africa. And so here I am working on the Ghana temple. That same trip, we also mucked through the slush and so forth on the Aba, Nigeria temple site. Just for anyone's interest, Aba, Nigeria is up in the center of the jungle, not the most populous part of Nigeria, but a Christian part of Nigeria. And I asked the stake president when we were there, we went to sacrament meeting in the Aba stake, and then we met with the stake president in his office, myself and my companions, and I said, President, why is the temple in Aba, temple under construction at that time? And he looked at me and said, oh, it's because this is where the Latter-day Saints are. Good for you. That's great. But it literally took 52 hours of travel to get from Salt Lake to Aba. It's a long way from anywhere. There are a number of buildings on that temple site, and it was really a remarkable experience to kind of clear out the ground, and a lot of it was, here's a New England word, rubbish, that we had to clear out of the way in order to create a temple. We had to build a road and a bridge to get to the temple site because there was no way to get heavy trucks and material to the place where the temple was going to be without building a road. We built the road, and the municipality named it Temple Road. And along the portion of the road where there were homes, from the time that we started and built the road to the time that the temple was dedicated, all of these little kind of shanty homes, they'd stopped and personally they'd all invested in fixing them up and painting their plaster and and fixing their fences, and Temple Road suddenly became this beautiful place where everyone suddenly had pride if you had frontage on Temple Road. And they all did it themselves. It was just a spontaneous thing. It was a beautiful thing. This is the Helsinki Temple in Finland, just underway. And then over the course of a couple years later, ultimately that temple was constructed. I'm just grabbing a couple of places that I had the opportunity to go to in my travels and to be a part of. Just various different amazing places in the world. Around that same time, this was 2005, President Hinckley announced his desire to renovate the Salt Lake Tabernacle and to strengthen it seismically. And the brethren came to me and asked if I would oversee that project specifically. And I thought, well, that'll be fun. I was trained in architecture back in upstate New York in historic preservation. And so this was going to be my first opportunity to really dig into a 19th century historic preservation. But good gosh, talk about one of the icons of the church, that we were going to take apart and put back together hopefully in a way that seemed seamless with its history, but that preserved it in such a way that it became a 21st century meeting space. And we had a lot of structural work to do. We had to excavate under the building and create new program space in a 2-layer deep basement under Temple Square. Put a new roof on it, new finishes throughout, new plaza all around once the structural work got done, and to make the building safe so that in the worst of earthquakes in some day to come, that the tabernacle would remain. Recently, you may be aware, a similar project has now been announced for the Salt Lake Temple. And so the other half of Temple Square is going to get the same kind of treatment that we did at the Salt Lake Tabernacle. I'm very familiar with that project on the Salt Lake Temple because I started it in 2005, and it's taken till now, 14 years later, for all of the engineering and so forth to come to fruition and all the design work long after I was gone to come to a point where they could announce the start of that project, which will go on now for the next 4 years. So I would drive to work literally every single morning. I'd pass on North Temple Street. I'd pass the Salt Lake Tabernacle. And if it was still standing, I knew I had a job. I mean, it was just that lump in my throat that caused me to think, what happens if that organ falls into the 2-story hole beneath it? I mean, we had it well shored up, don't get me wrong, but that magnificent instrument was literally propped up in the air as we excavated out 2 stories beneath it to put new program beneath it. And this is all a precursor to something that we did on an even larger scale of holding things in the air while we worked underneath it. Wonderfully happy the very first time I heard Clay Christiansen hit the keys of that organ again, and that it sounded sweet and lovely like it had before. Around that time, spent a lot of time traipsing around Europe. The outcome of that were temples in Kiev, in Paris, in Rome, in Lisbon, in addition to Helsinki that I mentioned before. On one trip, we were looking for contractors to build the Kiev temple, and we were in 11 different contractors' offices in 10 different cities over the course of 11 days in throughout Europe, trying to find the right people to work on the temple. Just a remarkable experience in doing the work around the world. This is us on one of the properties the church looked at for the temple in Lisbon. Really outstanding in our field on this one, in the tall grass. Wasn't a white shirt and tie day because we were going to be in some serious grass in this case. This trip to Lisbon was extremely important for me. This was in late 2011, and I had had some experiences about a year before this that caused me to really reflect on where my life was and where it was going. And you'll hear, if you go back and look at my other interviews, how much I had spent the first 50 years of my life denying my gender identity and pressing that dysphoria down into a tiny box inside of me and ignoring it and attempting to make it go away and having bouts where it just overwhelmed me. And the reality of suicidal ideation when I was 17 and when I was 34, and then again around this time when I was 49, 50 years old, that I could not suppress. And so I began finally at this point in life that journey, which of necessity to discover who I am. And that took many facets, many different approaches of exploration in my life. But one of the things that I did was I took all that airplane time to do a lot of reflection and a lot of journal writing. And particularly on this trip to Lisbon from Salt Lake, I can't sleep on airplanes because I'm terribly uncomfortable, and it doesn't matter if it's an overnight flight, I can't sleep, so I journaled. I journal into my laptop or into my telephone. And at that time, so much of my journaling was about my feelings of identity. And I wrote some particularly profound things to myself during that trip to Lisbon, that by the time I got to the hotel that next night, I was at that crossroads, that critical point where I had to answer, do I accept this about myself or not? I had a habit that I used to be very ashamed to admit, that once I got to hotels, I would have my layer of clothes in my suitcase that were my girl clothes. And I could relax and be myself in a hotel at night in my girl clothes. And just like I had done as a youth, in the safety of my bedroom, leave the pain of trying to be that other person most of the time. But that night in Lisbon, I felt the conviction that it was time to do something that I think Anne described a very similar experience this morning. I knelt down and offered my prayer that evening as Laurie for the first time in my life, fully expecting that, things could get dicey spiritually. Keep in mind, I'm a stake president at the time. I was all of these things. But I addressed my Father in heaven, and by the time that prayer was done, I knew that He knew who I was. And for the first time in my life, I realized He'd known who I was all along, and I was the one that was catching up. And I was the one who needed to get to that point of self-acceptance. And it brought a level of joy in my heart that the next day, which is when these photographs were taken from, I was skipping. I don't know how the other architects that were with me, what they thought must have been going on in my life, or what I might have had to drink that night before. But I was thrilled, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't guilty of feeling like a woman. I was a woman. And yet I still had to dress like this poor dude. But one of the things we did on these trips was we investigated the architecture of each region where we were going to build the temple. So we spent a lot of time in these really amazing places, learning the culture and style architecturally of each location to build them into the designs of the temples we were building. And so that's what you're seeing here. They weren't sightseeing tours. They were the hard work, but it was fun work too for who we were, of really learning the detail and the craft of what had gone on before us. In this picture, I'm looking out through a portal at the Atlantic Ocean from the other side, looking to the United States and New England, where I grew up. And I like this picture because I don't know what was going through my mind when it was taken, and I didn't realize it was being taken. But this is the poor chap that was reflecting on the fact that now I'm going to need the tissues. And I talked about this when I spoke at Affirmation 2 years ago. The world in which I had created for myself, thank you so much, that was husband, father, stake president, church chief architect, all of those things that were really the pinnacle of who I had been trying to be. I had all of that. And yet I was about to see all of that needing to be dismantled. And it also, as I related 2 years ago in my talk to Affirmation, I had to recognize that every single one of those life steps that brought me to that point, and those commitments that I had made and all that I had done, became thicker walls and stronger bars to the prison cell that I occupied, and really had no idea how I was going to get out alive, and if I would have anything left as a result of it. So I'm at a breathing point here. That was in late 2011. Around that same time, this is me, around that time, just to highlight the fact that life was what it was for me, the newspaper came and did an interview. They wanted to interview this person who had accomplished all these great things. And they sat down and interviewed me for a newspaper article for about an hour, and wrote up just a glorious piece about this, remarkable man who was a stake president and a church architect and did all these things all around the world, and yada yada yada. And this was the photograph that they took, which accompanied the article. And after all that, I remember distinctly, and the reason why I'm showing this photograph is because I'm really fond of looking at photographs of who I used to be. You're all the first who are getting to see this at my hand, seeing pictures of who I was. It's that as soon as I got this interview over and this picture taken, I went inside, went up to my room, took that lovely brown suit and tie off, and put my girl clothes back on, and went the rest of the day as Laurie. Because I knew who I was, and it wasn't the person who just gave that interview. Which brings me to this situation. Around that same time, this was the Provo Tabernacle for those of you that grew up on another planet. It seems like every person I've ever met in the church either went to a meeting or sang in a choir or did something, graduated from BYU in this building. And on December 10th, 2010, fire struck and it burned pretty much to the ground. The whole wood interior burned and collapsed into a pile. I remember the day specifically because my oldest granddaughter was born that day as well. And so each year when she celebrates her birthday, I remember the fire in the Provo Tabernacle. That was in December. By January of 2011, the ruins in the contents of the building had started to thaw. So much water had been pumped into the building that then immediately froze through a very cold holiday season that it took several weeks of picking through the ice to find whatever might have landed on what was left of the floor. Oops. Ahead of myself. This was a frightening sight. The brethren immediately became interested to know if the Provo Tabernacle could be reconstructed as a tabernacle. And given the fact that we had just 3 years before taken apart the Salt Lake Tabernacle and put it back together and done an acceptable job there, we got the assignment to examine to see if it could be brought back as a tabernacle. There was a lot of cultural, social pressure to bring this beautiful building back. There was fear that the church would have to raise what was left and sell the property, as just a loss. So I got the team back together that did Salt Lake Tabernacle, and for 6 months, we investigated what it would take to put the tabernacle back together. As I've explained to you at that same time, most of the time, this is what my life felt like. That despite all of the wonderful and glorious things that I had been able to do, like this building had done and been so much a glorious part of so many people's lives, at this time, as this building lay in ruins, I felt like I lay in ruins. There were many nights around this time where I would reach a certain point in my commute home where a high-speed highway exit without any guardrails in between had running really close to each other, and it was frequented by semi-tractor trailer trucks accelerating, trying to get on the highway, and I knew how easy it would have been to just tweak that steering wheel quickly and wind up in front of one of those trucks. Because I didn't know how I could get to the next day. Someone today, and I can't remember at the moment who, because I've got so much on my mind, could they get up and do one more day in a marriage? Was that you? Could I get up? Could I get up and do the church one more day? Can I even make it home? Can I go to the Stake Center and do an interview? Can I still do these things? This photograph was taken the day of the groundbreaking, and I should stop here and mention that somewhere between that last photograph and this one, the brethren decided privately, very covertly and quietly, to ask us if it could be a temple instead of the tabernacle. And so, believe it or not, I'm sitting at home on vacation in June of 2011, dressed in my girl clothes because the house was empty and I was home alone. And I get a call from my boss, who at that time is now a member of the presiding bishopric. He was my boss at that time. And he shared that news with me, that rather than the Provo Tabernacle being a tabernacle, the brethren wanted to know if, big if, it could be a temple. And we talked about that for a few minutes, and as I hung up the phone, he had also told me, don't tell anyone, because no one can possibly know that they've asked this question, because it'll get out, and then it'll force their hands. So that was in June. We had between June and October, when it was announced in conference that the church was going to restore the tabernacle as a temple, we had those several months to keep this absolutely quiet, but to design it and figure out if it could be done. And so I hung up the phone, and I'm sitting there, very much like my experience in Lisbon. I'm like, okay, doing this in my girl clothes? Is it okay if Laurie picks up some pieces of paper and a pencil and starts laying out a temple inside of that existing building? I had some drawings with me on vacation, because, the work never goes away, of the tabernacle, and so I started laying out the temple. I was going to show you some pictures of those sketches. I have them, but they're in a box that I can't get to at the moment in Utah. But over the course of the next few hours, I sketched out the organization of the rooms inside that shell of the Provo Tabernacle that became the concept plan for the temple that's there now. And as I look back on that wasn't this guy that did it. That was Laurie that did it. And God was all right with that, as he had been in so many of the other assignments that I had. I don't know why I put this picture in, because it just shows me, instead of enjoying the moment of basking in Elder Holland, breaking ground for the temple, I'm already telling this other fellow who was the project architect, hey, you got to get this part of it right. I guess I was kind of intense. Never a rest. So the solution was to excavate underneath the entire building, 2 stories down, 45 feet into the ground, and into the groundwater beneath the tabernacle. A lot of folks thought that we actually lifted the tabernacle up while we worked underneath it, like you'd put a car on a lift to change the oil. Well, that wasn't the case whatsoever. We held the box of the tabernacle exactly still. It just looked like it was floating in midair. It was actually in the same spot it had always been. In fact, it was so important that it stay in that spot that we had constant surveying being done of points all around the building to make sure that it didn't move at all, in its experience while we were digging out underneath it, because the design was incumbent upon the fact that it was going to still be there in that spot when we were ready to build in and up to it. Well, we assumed, quite surprisingly, that the potential was that it would sink. It's a pretty heavy component of masonry standing in the air. We assumed that our fear was that it was going to sink. Guess what it felt like when they reported to us that the survey marks were actually rising, and that what you're seeing in this picture actually lifted out of the ground 1.5 inches, all on its own. Well, why did that happen? The best minds all came together and said, oh, silly us, we took 45 feet of dirt off the ground. It's rebounding into the, up. The Earth's crust is lifting because we took so much weight off of it. And so we all scratched our heads and said, I wonder if we can put enough weight back in so it'll go back to where it was. And that's what happened. The weight of the foundation, the weight of the 2 stories that we put back in underneath this building was enough that within 1/16 of an inch it went back to its original location, and our design didn't have to be modified. So on the underneath the tabernacle frame floating 45 feet in the air above us, that was a surreal experience. So I've given another presentation in which I talk about this building, literally coming back to a new life from the ashes. I mean, it's a very powerful image. But I didn't, at that time, relate it to my own experience of coming forth from my own spiritual, emotional, and mental ashes to become the beautiful person I feel that I am now. This is just cool because I'm standing on the roof. And that's the tower. Before I showed pictures of the final, I stand in awe of what we were able to accomplish on that project, both from a physical standpoint as well as a beauty, artistic and architectural accomplishment. One of the most significant things that I had to work on, we talked about how we had these 1 in a million projects, 1 in a million lifetime projects, and by the time we did this one, we'd done 2 or 3 of these once in a million lifetimes kind of projects. But relating to what we do now, I've had a chance to build a lot of really cool buildings, but now I get a chance to build a lot of really cool people. And I started with, I think Josh talked about the Petri dish. I was my prototype rebuild a person project, and it happened at this time under the direction of the same God. I remember right in the middle of that design process for the tabernacle becoming temple, I was kneeling and had my experience where right in the middle of praying about something regarding work, I felt this rush of feeling, and that voice of the Spirit that I knew so well declared to me that you are a beloved daughter of heavenly parents, followed by an immediate outpouring of divine love like I have never experienced before or since, that can't be mimicked by any other means, natural or unnatural. I felt just a dose of what that divine love feels like, that we all have the opportunity to look forward to in a future day. I didn't ask for that. It happened. And it gave me to know at a time when I needed to know that regardless of what I was asked and what people said to me, regardless of who said it, that I knew what God knew, and I had felt His love. A few months later, through means that I'm not going to bother to explain right now, the general authorities learned that I believed myself to be transgender. This was in the fall of 2012. I was called in to meet with one general authority after another. Started with Elder Don R. Clark, L. Whitney Clayton, then presiding Bishop Gary Stevenson, now a member of the Quorum of the 12. They had a lot of questions for me. I think I counted at one point that I had 11 general authority interviews over the course of about 5 weeks, which was no big shakes because I worked with general authorities all the time, right? Except it wasn't, because I was on the hot seat. It wasn't me being the technical professional presenting to them. It was me being pinned down for being such a sinful atrocity as to believe that, I could be this messed up. Haven't you ever read the Proclamation on the Family? I challenge you to go and study prayerfully with faith the Proclamation on the Family. But Elder so-and-so, I've already done that. And I testified to them of the experiences I've shared with you that I experienced during prayer. And that kind of a testimony with a sure witness of the Spirit, I sure needed it, because I was having to face some of the wheels, the big wheels in the church administration, and testify to them that I knew who I was. And at that time, they went to the First Presidency, the Quorum of the 12 in the Temple. And, the brethren meet, the 15 meet every Thursday in the Salt Lake Temple to deal with all of the big issues in the church for that week. And one week in October of 2012, one of the big issues that Elder Clayton and President Packer, if you can imagine having those two on your side to defend your case, those two brethren were voiced to the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 to discuss the circumstances of this transgender stake president in Tooele, Utah, and what are we going to do about him. And the decision was made that, given the fact that I'd served 8.5 years, that I could be quietly released without any fanfare, and that would be the end of that, and that they could, just say what they had to say to me and be done. And the very next day, my direct leaders at work, the presiding bishopric, the three of them, met with the same First Presidency Friday morning. The other big meeting in the church is the meeting of the First Presidency and the presiding bishopric on all administrative and temporal matters of the church. And on that Friday morning, right after the Thursday morning, one of the big issues was, what are we going to do about the chief architect of the church who's transgender? And at that point, I had for 5 years been in that same room with the First Presidency talking to them about temples. And I wasn't some unknown person in the ranks of employment of the church. I had one of those few assignments, put a paid employee in the midst of vocalizing presentations to the brethren, to the First Presidency. Well, they released me from being stake president, but fortunately the First Presidency, and I learned this through Bishop Stevenson, First Presidency told the bishopric that we really like what Brother Hall does for us, and so long as Brother Hall is temple worthy, we want him to stay as a church employee. And I was happy to hear that news, and I really appreciated that. So for the next 4 years, the brethren knew who I was, and I still was employed there. a situation for which I was very grateful, and which led to what I'll explain in a moment. But it was awkward because I was told not to do a whole lot of things that I had been doing, including being affiliated with any group such as this. No online support groups. Don't talk about it to anyone. Don't talk about it at work, by all means. Don't ever wear women's clothing, ever, 24/7, 365. I discovered at that point just how invasive the human resource manual of the church employees was into my life, that every aspect of my day and night was monitored. Constraints that I wound up having to break, all of them, over the next several months. But meanwhile, we produced this. This is the baptistry of the City Center Temple. The endowment room, one of the two endowment rooms, where the presentation of the garden and creation occurs. The upper second endowment room with the veil presentation. Everything taking cues from the architectural details that we pulled out of that icy rubble after the fire. The celestial room of the temple. And the ceiling room, large ceiling room in the temple. And this is my team that did that project, standing in front of the completed temple. And this is one chance I'm going to point myself out. There's this long-haired kid that looks like they're in transition, because they were. By the time the temple finished, I had been on hormones for 2 years. I'd let my hair grow out way beyond church office building standards. And I was living the dream, moving very quickly towards authenticity and having the challenge of being Laurie in my home life and this other guy at work. And anyway, it was complicated. About 10 months after the presentation to the brethren, where the decision to keep me on as an employee took place, about 10 months later, I received what to me at the time was extremely startling news that I was not going to be allowed to work on temples any longer. And in my mind, although no one said it, because they didn't even explain to my boss, who had to tell me this, why it was being done. But I knew why it was being done. The brethren in middle management had to, in their minds, protect the first presidency and get me away from them. And so, although they'd been told by the first presidency that I needed to remain an employee so long as I had a temple recommend, which I did, they could reassign me to anything they wanted. And so they assigned me to work on special projects, and particularly to have responsibility for the upcoming redesign of the Provo Missionary Training Center. But I was grieved by the way that change was handled. And I really struggled for several weeks, I'll be honest, that can I continue to work in this organization if I'm going to be seen and treated in this fashion after all that's been done? And I thought a lot of angry thoughts. And I think there's a learning experience in what happened and what I did next that actually kept me engaged. But this slide kind of shows, and yes, that was my name. what I call my dead name now. This overlays my badge working for the missionary department on top of a picture of the Ogden Temple being rededicated, which I had worked on. And this is symbolic of my new assignment being layered on top of my old assignment. So I had to make a decision, and often we have to make decisions. Am I going to pick myself up and rise above the garbage that's been handed to me and once again move forward and do something? And the opportunity to work on the Missionary Training Center at the time didn't seem all that special to me. I thought, this is a major league downgrade. I was wrong. But what made it wrong was what wound up happening. And I got the inspiration, again, that magnificent gift of the Spirit that comes to those who strive to hear. I didn't know how to approach a missionary training center. I'd never done one. In fact, in modern history, no one had done a new missionary training center. And so there was no handbook to go to. And so I did the next best thing. I opened up Preach My Gospel, intentionally reading it from cover to cover to learn what it said to me, but listen with your spiritual ears, what the Spirit said to me while I read those words needed to be incorporated into the design of a new missionary training center. And at the end of that process, I went up to my whiteboard, and that's what this photograph is, and I wrote down the various elements that the Spirit had said to me needed to be part of a new missionary training center. And for the next 3 years, this is what my whiteboard looked like, because I refused to erase it. It was such a beautiful experience of coming up with what I called the MTC guidelines, these elements of how the project was to convey the Spirit to the missionaries, how we were to spaces that made an opportunity for missionaries to have changes come in their lives. I built this into a presentation on slides, and I took it to some of the brethren in my department, and I took it to the missionary department, and then I took it to the Missionary Executive Committee that was at that time chaired by none other than Russell Nelson. Perhaps you've heard of him. And with all of my normal audacity, said, Elder Nelson, these are the principles that I think should guide the design of this missionary training center. They were accepted and adopted. Elder Nelson brought those things to the First Presidency. They were approved. They became our marching orders for the project. And we began sketching. This is another whiteboard experience that became ultimately this site plan sketch that I did. This is fun because I actually had these sketches available that I could photograph them and share them with you. And that became the site plan of the new MTC, which is represented here in this model, physical model that's now in the Provo Missionary Training Center, but at this time is sitting in my office at the church office building. Meanwhile, we hit the road again, and in this case, we went to one of the great places in the country where you can see amazing outdoor spaces, Washington, D.C., except the timing of our project required that we were there in January, so it was dang cold. But so this is me leading our team around Washington, D.C. on a very cold January afternoon. If you look really closely, not only is my hair a little on the long side, but I'm wearing all women's clothing in these photos. My little androgynous kind of way of being when I was away from the office building, I was semi-being me. And we were able to learn a great deal on that trip and on other trips and experiences as we worked together to begin to create the beautiful spaces that the missionaries now enjoy. The design of the building began with sketches. And these are sketches that I did, developed the design even further. And ultimately, our design team modeled it into these design presentation boards that ultimately we started constructing, got approved and started constructing. At that same time, I had an opportunity to go on family vacation for a week. And so this is 2 months later, in March of whatever year that was, 2016, 2 months after the Washington trip, I went back to Virginia with my former wife and our daughter, and visited my younger sister. This is my younger sister in the picture with me. Some people say we look a fair bit alike. She's also 6 foot tall, which really gives me a lot of confidence. I'm not just tall because I was once testosterone poisoned. I'm tall because we're 6 foot Norwegian women. That's how our family is. But anyway, this is my little sister, and she's very open and accepting of me. And I show this picture because that week in March of 2016, I decided, here's a chance for me. I'm away from Utah. Here's a chance for me to really be Laurie full-time. And I wanted to see what that was like, because at that point, although I'd been trying to be Laurie when I could, I was also having to switch genders every day, which, by the way, is enough to blow your mind, switching genders multiple times a day. 7 straight days I could be Laurie full-time. This was my practice to see if I really liked living full-time. It's crazy that I had to actually practice that, because I've been hoping for it, for 50 years at this point. But here's me in the Atlantic Ocean. And do I look happy? It was a little chilly in March to be in the Atlantic Ocean in Virginia, but this is how excited I was to be able to be me. And then just a couple weeks later, I'm back at the MTC. Here I am with Elder Brent Nielsen, who was the director of missionary department, a member of the Quorum of the 70. I look pretty happy in that picture, too. It was the day that we topped off the steel for the Missionary Training Center, and I was giving a tour to all of the visiting general authorities and dignitaries. This is the picture that my partner looked at and said, "You got to be kidding. You looked like that and you were still working for the church?" It's like, oh, well, yeah, I was. And look, they're all listening to me. And there's the Missionary Training Center in the background, and it's all getting framed up and so forth. And I'm giving the tour. And here we are marching around in our orange vests, and here's the big to-do ceremony that took place, and I'm there on the left end, kind of contemplating, how great life is. Then several months later, in September, I should back up. This picture was taken at the Missionary Training Center on my last day of employment for the church. And the two folks that are with me, these two gentlemen, were from the architectural firm that we worked with in Portland, Oregon, that did the Missionary Training Center with us. And when this photo was taken, it was early afternoon. We had just gone to lunch together, and I came out to them as transgender, because I had to explain to them that I was gone as of that afternoon and would no longer be on the project. How they accepted me, they weren't Latter-day Saints, and they lived in Portland, so they're fairly good folk in terms of being open and accepting, but how they accepted me was really precious to me. But I have to go back and give a little bit of background as to why I was no longer going to be employed by the church. I showed you where I was in March, that I was trying to be full-time for a week. By May of that year, 2016, my bell rang, if you recognize what that phrase means. The genie came out of the bottle. And when the genie comes out of the bottle, you can't stuff the genie back in the bottle. All of that is code for transgender folk that says basically I had to go full-time and there was no going backwards. The swapping of living different genders from day to day had to end. And so I started attending church as Laurie. That kind of blew my ward's mind. I had been their bishop. I had been their stake president. And I came out to them in a fast and testimony meeting. And some people hugged me and thought it was the greatest thing that had ever happened. And some people thought it was the greatest atrocity that had ever come over a pulpit. It was hard. That was in July. By July of 16, I was full-time Laurie, except at work. Now, you remember that in 2015 in Utah, the Utah Compromise had been passed, and we all rejoiced that it had. But I knew in March of 2015, when that was approved, that it didn't apply to me because I worked for a religious employer. But at this point, when I'm already living full-time away from work, I approached my managing director and my human resources director and said, oh, by the way, a couple months before I had come out to everyone at work, crossing the last constraint the bishopric gave me off the list of things that I was not supposed to do or I'd be fired. Well, I managed to cross them all off the list. And when I finally came out to everyone in April of 2016, I was really down the road. There was no turning back. But I sat down with my boss in July of that year, and his question to me was, what are we going to do about this? And I said, well, here's the situation. This is what I need to know. We know that the church was instrumental in passing the Utah Compromise, and contained in it is a very ethical way of treating gender dysphoric employees, in that gender transition is not to be grounds for employment discrimination in the state of Utah. Yet I recognize the church has a religious employer exception. However, I want the brethren, I want yourselves to consider carefully if on that point alone, the morality and the ethics of allowing a high-quality employee to transition gender presentation so that I can continue to be not only the high-quality employee that I have been, but I will promise you I will be a more complete and whole person, less likely to be absent from work so frequently because of mental and emotional breakdowns. I'd burned through 200-something days of sick leave in the previous couple years. They all knew that. I said, I can be much better for you than I even have been if you'll let me do this. It's the right thing to do. Will you get me the real answer, not just somebody's opinion, but I want the real answer, which meant going to the General Human Resource Committee of the church, which was chaired by the First Presidency, to answer the question. And that was on a Friday. Following Tuesday, my stake president asked me to meet with him. So I went into his office and he said, I've made the decision to take your recommend from you. And remember that this young man was my second counselor in the stake presidency, so we knew each other quite well. I said, oh, hang on a minute. I said, before you do that, you and I both have the questions memorized. Let's go through them together. So while he sat in my old chair, I asked the question and then gave the answer. And for an hour, we talked through the most detailed temple recommend interview I ever gave. And it was kind of my life was on the line to give this interview to myself. And at the end of the interview, he said, based on all that you've told me, I can't, in good conscience, take your recommend from you. Thank you, President. See you later. So I left, recommend intact. 48 hours later, he called me back in. And when he called me back in, I recognized what was occurring. Despite the fact that he had told me that he was doing these things under his own volition, he was totally being directed what to do. And I already had my answer with regard to whether I was going to be allowed to transition as an employee. So in that case, we sat down. He repeated again, I have to take your recommend. So I surrendered it, and he tried to talk to me for a few minutes. I said nothing. He finally said, aren't you going to say anything? I said, this is unjust, and we both know it, and I left. Next day, I handed in my notice that I intended to retire from church employment, which fortunately I could at that point. And by the time this picture was taken, I was on my way out. That was in September of 2016. On the good side, it gave me an opportunity to do what I needed to do. I quickly got busy and got my legal name changed, got my gender identity markers all changed through the process that exists at the present time. Got all my documents changed out so that I was officially who I am. I took all of my clothes to Desert Industries and laid my entire professional wardrobe and all my play clothes that were male, at the feet of Desert Industries as a donation. Felt really good a few days later when I went back into the store and saw all my business suits lined up on the racks. and I never looked back and got busy with the rest of my life. Well, I think the next slide is this one. This was a couple months after I left church employment. I had an interview with that firm in Portland that I really enjoyed working with, that did the MTC with us, and they were pretty keen on hiring me. And so I had a couple of phone interviews with them, and on this particular day, this was what I was wearing when I had an in-person interview with them in Salt Lake. And I had my daughter snap this picture of me right after the interview because I was pretty happy with how that interview went. And I felt kind of cute that day, too, because, what had happened was we had just such a great conversation about what I could do going to work for them. And I was ready to move up to Portland and to start this new chapter of my life and to be able to practice my craft as my authentic self. And all of that just seemed very sunny, and I was really happy. And within the next 6 weeks, not only that firm, but another firm that I was also interviewing with in a positive way, and every other contact I had in Salt Lake that I had ever worked with stopped talking to me. And I had literally nowhere to turn professionally, other than to myself. And so I'll come back to what I did next in a moment, but I wanted to take a minute to run through quickly the slides of the Missionary Training Center, because as you saw, it was still under construction when I left church employment. And that felt really, I think that was the most sad thing to me about leaving, was I had to leave this project midstream that I had had such joy in producing, and such a personal part of me. And, I was talking with Walt and Laurie Wood last night about the fact that of all the projects that I'd done, as big and beautiful and wonderful and artistic and so forth that they were, this was the most people-oriented project that I ever did. And to me, the most important for that reason, because of what it did for the people who would be using this building, or a group of buildings, and its landscape. I was really astonished when the head of the missionary department told me that what happens in the landscape of the Missionary Training Center is more important than what happens in the classroom. I thought, say what? Because when I went to the Missionary Training Center, it was all about what happened in that classroom. That little 6x8 box with a little slot of a window, and the low ceilings and the lousy air conditioning, if there was any at all. It was all about what happened 16 hours a day in that classroom. Literally, their paradigm had shifted to where they felt that what happened in the spaces of the landscape was fully as important, if not more important, than what happened in the classroom. So we went about, one of our great guiding principles was what are we going to do with the exterior spaces to help connect missionaries to their God. And we created some pretty nice inside and exterior spaces for them. So I'll just click through these. As I do this, I also want to explain my excommunication took place on Pride Sunday in 2017. Yeah, that was ironic, right? I'm sitting in disciplinary council thinking, it's Pride Sunday. I wonder if anybody else in the room is thinking about the irony here. We all know how that turned out. I was excommunicated after 4.5 hours of grueling discussion to accomplish what they had already intended to do when I first came in. Did you ever have the experience of your stake president tells you you have the option to write a letter and resign your membership in the church, or change back to who you were before you came out? I did. What do you think the outcome of the disciplinary council is going to be if the stake president already told you to write the damn letter to leave the church? So it was a foregone conclusion. So that happened on Pride Sunday. Right around the time the Missionary Training Center became occupied by missionaries. And a few weeks prior to all of that occurring, I received an invitation from church headquarters, of all places. The managing director of the priesthood department was arranging a tour of general authorities and key project members of the Missionary Training Center development team, and he wanted me to attend. And he knew that I had transitioned because he had written a glowing reference letter for me over his signature, personal signature, talking about what a great architect Laurie Hall was and how she, and all of this. It was just, he's a really good man who fully accepted what I did, what I needed to do. And I said, Richard, I'm afraid when that tour takes place, I'll have already had my disciplinary council. So I probably am not going to be a member of the church at that point. He said, that's fine, I want you to come. And after the council took place, I wrote to him again. I said, Richard, it happened, I'm out. And I said, I understand if that's uncomfortable for you and the brethren who are going to be walking through to have me there. I said, I can bow out of this. Oh no, we need you to be there. So 48 hours after the administrative action took place that put me out of the church, I came onto this campus that I loved so much, and with a group of senior employees and general authorities, we walked through a VIP tour of the Missionary Training Center. And as we encountered every missionary district, like the one that you see in this photograph, they stopped and we talked about the project and how the missionaries were affected by it. And I was introduced as the chief architect for the project. I might have even had this dress on that night. I told my dear friend Richard, I said, hey, the best I can do is I'm coming and I'm going to look like a mission president's wife. I said, that's who I am. And he said, that's who we want. Around this enormous project, every now and then one of the party would slow down and kind of get me aside by themselves. Like Elder Steve Allen, remember the Quorums of the 70. He'd say, how you doing? How's this working out for you? I don't understand what you're going through, but we love you. And, that happened multiple times that night. And if Tuesday night hadn't happened, it was a balm. It was a healing process for me. Sunday night's sting would have been much more grievous. But it was really remarkable to me that on the one hand, I could be literally put out and othered, using Greg Prince's words, to the extreme degree that the church is able to do, and then just 2 nights later be brought back and welcomed and credited and celebrated for who I am and who I was and what I was able to contribute. It's ironic, but it's exemplary of the difficulty of who we all are and how that's intersecting with Mormonism at this point. It's complicated, and at times it's really, really difficult and egregious, and at times it's exciting. I have a good friend that some of you would know, who's an out transgender woman, active in the LDS Church, continues to live with her wife. They're active in the ward where my friend served as first counselor in the ward bishopric the week before she transitioned to live full time. That was 6 years ago. Faithfully attending that ward week after week after week and being ignored and unappreciated, etc., for a long, long time. Just recently, she and her wife were called together to teach the nursery. She and her wife were asked to speak on Easter Sunday and teach about the atonement of Jesus Christ from the pulpit. She and I transitioned kind of together. She was my mentor in some ways. Her patience and faith has paid off. And that's how it ought to be operating. It ought to be okay. I've often said jokingly that, I just want church members to realize that trans women don't eat babies. And now in that ward, the members of the ward are bringing their babies to a trans woman. And it's okay. It's safe. I'll talk more about this in my address that I give in International Conference next month, but I remain constructively engaged with the church because it's important for me to be visible, not because it's not hard, because it is hard. I want to be visible because I know that gender nonconforming people in every single Latter-day Saint ward in the church. And every time that they can see someone like myself or Anne or my friend who's serving in the nursery out and authentic, loving, accepting, and accepted trans persons, we move a little bit closer to being able to normalize this whole experience as part of who we are as Latter-day Saints. To finish my pictures, if you haven't walked through this, the opportunity won't be yours again unless you happen to wind up being able to teach there, but it really is a remarkable place. Around that time, I started being involved in affirmation. Hey, look, I'm wearing the same dress. It's my affirmation go-to dress. This is us meeting with public affairs in September of 17, not long after my excommunication. There's a lot of familiar faces in that photograph, including Richard Turley, who's the managing director of Church Public Affairs. We got to tell our stories that day and continue a dialogue, and that's part of our constructive engagement with the church, not because we're going to change the church, but to keep that dialogue open and to keep our stories, our authentic stories, in front of them. While at the meantime, we engage deliberately in building strong communities everywhere there are Latter-day Saints or former Latter-day Saints in the world. In this photograph are a number of our leaders of affirmation in Latin America. They told some fantastic stories that day. As I mentioned, I would eventually tell you what I did professionally. Since no one else would hire me who had ever worked with the church, I started my own practice, as was mentioned. This is me in my new office in Salt Lake, back at the time in August of 17 when I started my architecture practice. This is Pride Sunday in 2018, exactly 1 year after I was excommunicated. Standing there with these two handsome gentlemen who you know, Aaron and Jed. We had just got done carrying the affirmation banner the length of the Pride Parade in Salt Lake City. And it dawned on me that it may have been the church's intention to silence me on Pride Sunday in 2017 when I was excommunicated. But this experience, walking in the Pride Parade and in all of my opportunities to share my journey along the way, the journey of an excommunicant and a servant of the LGBTQ community, that I get to tell my story, and I get to tell your story, and I get to tell our story in ways that I think they never imagined if they thought they could quiet me, how much stronger and louder our voices are, despite what has occurred. So, this is my current Facebook picture. I took this when I was on my way to an Equality Utah event last November, right at the time when trans erasure was a big deal in the news. And I got pretty sober about trans erasure and wrote some things that Affirmation published. And the caption under this picture is, "It's serious now." And so here's my serious photo. Thank you. Water time? I want to take some questions. I didn't leave as much time for questions as I had hoped to, but yes.
Do you still have affiliation with some of your past coworkers since the MTC experience?
I do. In fact, I don't know how many of you saw the press conference when they announced the Salt Lake Temple project and the Temple Square renovation, but my mates were the ones talking that day, and so I wrote to several of them that were involved in that press conference, and then I knew that were involved in the project, and just congratulated them on finally seeing through what we had worked on for 14 years, what they had worked on for 14 years at that point, and bringing it to fruition. And all three of the ones that I wrote to, the managing architect, or the lead architect, and the project manager, all wrote back to me in very friendly tones to Laurie, and grateful for the things I'd done to help get them where they were. And it was very happy for me to be able to still have the ability to communicate with those folks, although they don't understand nor can they appreciate what I did or why I had to do it. But I'm grateful that I could still be associates and friends. So it's not like we go to lunch together all the time and are buddy-buddy, but the connections are still there, and who knows what may come of that someday. Questions? Yes?
So you didn't outright say this, but it was kind of insinuated. I just was wondering, with those firms that didn't hire you from Portland or Salt Lake, what was the insinuation, and do you feel that it was possible that they were asked not to?
I think in many cases, I'm certain that happened. It happened so abruptly that it wasn't coincidence. And I've since that time, I've had a few associates come to me privately and say, "Yeah, we were told not to associate with you," which makes some people absolutely irate and think that I need to, hire a lawyer. Yeah, I could do that, but unfortunately, we dragged so many of my associates through a very difficult situation. Other questions? Grayson.
I have one on the lady with the baby outside the name. I don't remember.
Was it Cher? Yeah, Cher.
She wanted to ask if you were involved at all with the apparently the Mesa Temple is getting
Major renovation? Yeah. I had early involvement on Mesa. And as well, some of the things that surround the Mesa Temple, but some of the renovation of Mesa Temple took place at an earlier time. The major renovation's now underway. I can't speak to all of that at this point because that happened mostly after my time. But, for those of you that live in this area, I oversaw Phoenix and Gilbert's temples get built and Gila Valley, which I really enjoyed doing because of its cute little building.
I also have.
Yeah. Another second question from Grayson.
This one on my behalf. Just if you could be in charge of, any architecture project, if there was any project that you could design, what would it be? What would you most want to bring into the world? If you had all of the resources and design teams and whatever.
Given my background and experience, my family members all told me that I really needed to put a bid in on Notre Dame. I have a little experience in putting back together historic structures that have been damaged by fire. So I was thinking of putting together a little proposal for the Vatican to take a look at. I hear they've got about $1.5 billion as a starting budget for that project. Now, can you imagine how that's going to get done? It makes the little stuff that I did in Utah not too impressive. Actually, though, as amazing as that project would be, to be more serious of an answer, I learned a lot because of my experience at the Missionary Training Center. I had strong feelings about doing temples and some of these other buildings because they all have the missions that they have. But there was such a personal people element to the MTC that projects that really make a difference and change people's hearts and feelings, and those are hard to get. But that would be the ideal project, is something that really did something good for humanity. Whether you believe in the missionary work of the church or not, a lot of bodies are going to go through those buildings through the years, and a lot of lives are going to be affected both there and as they go out and do their thing. I should stop and tell you that my patriarchal blessing, which I received at the hands of a patriarch who had no idea who I was when I was a brand new member of the church back in 1980, talked about the fact that if I got my education and used my talents, particularly in the service of my fellow men, that I would be an instrument in the hands of the Lord to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. And I watched that get fulfilled in so many different ways, and ultimately, lastly, in that building. And maybe there's yet another way that gets fulfilled, of spreading the true gospel of Jesus Christ, which is love and acceptance, to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. Please.
Speaking of love and acceptance, do you have children, and how have they reacted?
Good, bad, and ugly comes to mind. I love each of my children. I do not have an equal relationship at this point with each of my children. I came out to each of them and their spouses now 7 years ago. Some have had a better time with it than others. It's complicated, very complicated. And now I'm in a relationship with another person who also has children and their spouses, and that's complicated. Families are messy. and you don't need to go through gender transition, to have messiness in families, and yet, it does contribute to messiness. I'm grateful, and I get to see my kids and grandkids that will see me later this month up in Utah, and I'm grateful for them. The little grandchildren won't know me as anything but Poppy, but the older ones remember that I was that guy you saw in the photos earlier, and they've kind of gone through that process with me. But it's a tender thing, and I love what Nathan has taught, that the church needs to know that we're as concerned about holding our loving families together as anyone else in the church is. Whether we're in or out of the church, we're just as concerned in Affirmation about our loving families and holding them together as any other church member would be. Question?
I don't know if you answered this when you got off the picture, but your last day at work, those two men that went to lunch with you and you came up to them, I missed it. Did you say what they did to accept you, or how did you? Oh,
it was just a positive experience. They'd been with me in Washington, D.C., year before. They had worked with me closely for 3 years, and, I dropped this little bombshell on them and had lunch with them and ran. But they stayed in touch, and I stayed in touch with them. I still count them as good friends. One of the two fellows is Jewish, and often I would make sure that I words escape me, wish him well on the high Jewish holidays. And sometimes he would wish me well on Jewish holidays as well, Happy Rosh Hashanah. But we have a good relationship, distance notwithstanding. I count them as friends. Other questions? Please.
Do you need help for attending church together, or?
Yeah, good question. As I mentioned, I try to stay constructively engaged. Coincidentally, she and I are both teenage converts from Massachusetts. We have common background that way. And she lives a very nuanced life with regard to the church, as do I. And we do attend in our ward in Kentucky. And they're very accepting of me, to the point where it makes me wonder if they really do know anything about my background. If they're all watching tonight, hi. But I've been fortunate to attend, any meetings I wish to attend. I can attend Relief Society as one of the sisters. I'm fully welcome. No one's ever asked about my membership status, so I sense that somebody in the ward knows my circumstances. But we do get to attend when we choose to, and we choose to frequently. Yeah. Please.
When I was coming out, one of the things that I kind of realized as I gained transgender friends is that was going to be one of the big struggles of the church. So I just want to know how your church leaders deal with you having had the priesthood and how they treat you now. Yeah.
Well, of course, it's a little bit of a non-issue at this point since excommunication took place. We have another elder in the room in a dress who's or two. But here's how I handled it. When I began attending church full-time as Laurie, I actually wrote a note to my stake president, who, as I mentioned, I had served with for years, and I said, President, based on my understanding of current church policy and practices, if I'm a woman in the LDS church, I shouldn't be utilizing the priesthood. And I said, my recommendation to you, President, is that you should ask me to not exercise the priesthood that I have. And I said, my experience working with black members of the church back in New York in the 1980s who had been members of the church prior to the revelation on blacks in the priesthood, who had discovered their African ancestry after having been ordained. That's how the brethren handled it. If you're an elder and you've discovered because you were diligent in doing your family history that you actually had African American ancestry, but you'd already been ordained, the brethren simply asked, please do not exercise the priesthood that you hold. So I said, well, there's a precedent anyway for how to handle me. I made that offer to him so he wouldn't have to struggle to figure out what to do. I don't know if that fully answers your question or not. I think that's an issue. I mean, there are a lot of gendered issues for church administration to think through. My hope is that someday, after the someday that Greg Prince talked about, that the other someday there's another revelation where all this gets sorted out effectively. Ladies.
So, I've asked you this question before, that when you're a bishop or a stake president, did you have anyone come to you and reveal that they were LGBT? And the answer might have been no.
Yeah, ironically, over 15 years of serving as bishop and stake president, I never once had someone come into my office and out themselves to me. I would have been the most open and gracious and accepting. I would hope so. I have no idea. I literally hope I would have been the most tolerant person they could have ever hoped to have run into. The happy news is that I count among two of my dear friends, two young people, fully transitioned trans women now, who grew up in the stake with me being their stake president. And we're good friends now, and they can look back and say, yeah, I remember you when, and we all kind of laugh about that, that they were deacons and teachers and so forth as I was the presiding authority. In hindsight, I would have liked that opportunity just to test my mettle. I sense I would have been pretty sympathetic, especially as years went on. It was like, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. I'm struggling with that too. What are we going to do? Because I was in that struggle I've described for the last 3 years of being as stake president. It consumed me. And it would have been kind of cool to talk to somebody about it. Yeah, I wish you'd all been part of that stake. Could have had some fun together. Was there another question, or yeah? Did you?
Okay. If it's too personal or whatever, that's fine. But just to clarify, when you went to the disciplinary court and they excommunicated you after already talking about that there wasn't any grounds really to do that, what did they give? Is there a reason? Or, were there other things you left out? If that's fine, that's fine.
So the natural question is, am I hiding any egregious sin that I committed? Was there any malfeasance that I actually managed to accomplish? No, there was absolutely no reason to excommunicate me, other than I was a prominent ecclesiastic leader and a prominent church employee who had the audacity of authenticity. Sarah, did you have a question?
Well, just part of the process, they have to give you a plan of correction.
Oh, yes, I have that letter still. It is the most convoluted thing I've ever seen in my life. I defy a stake president who ever has to sit down with me and read that letter and figure out what on earth I'm supposed to do to get back in. I'm aware, I'll be pretty blunt right now with you for a moment, because this does hit me kind of at home. I'm aware of individuals who are in high church leadership responsibilities who were convicted for molesting their own grandchildren, and while they were serving as ecclesiastical leaders in their wards and stakes, who were excommunicated from the church and who have now been rebaptized after their probation and their years of repentance and whatever and so forth. They have a way back into the church. I don't believe I have a way back into church membership as things currently stand. That's 2 chapters of Revelation of Greg Prince's book beyond what's been written at this point. There's no way back for me in terms of how things are structured presently. Please.
How have you dealt with the emotional trauma? This whole process has inflicted on you.
I really appreciated what Mindy said to me last night, that often I seem so very calm about all this. And part of the answer when I talked with her about this last night was my faith and trust is in God. And I know where I stand with deity. I know where I stand in relationship to my Savior and the atonement. And yes, there have been some terrible injustices done, but I'm not going to dwell on that. Much like my experience when I sat down and said, am I going to, burn my office down and walk out of here, or am I going to learn how to design a missionary training center? I think it was my choice, and I think it's all of our opportunities to choose in life. If we've been done wrong, and I think many of us, if not all of us, have been done wrong, what are we going to do about it? What are we going to choose to do? And, I've chosen to grieve and to go through my grieving process. I was pretty much grieving when I did that interview with John DeLynn. I was in tears through most of that interview. I was really, really raw at that time, only 6 weeks after the excommunication. But I went through the grieving process, and it's an important process to go through, and it's not linear. But I wasn't going to build a house there and live there. It's important to me to find the next thing to do, and the next people to serve, and the next opportunity to bless lives. And that's what keeps me going. And I love the old movie, The Gumball Rally, from way back in the 70s. And one of the things that one of the race car drivers said was he grabbed the rearview mirror and he ripped it off the car and he threw it out the window as he started the race. And he said, well, what's behind me is not important. That's a great idea. What's behind me is not important. Thank you. Yes. Please.
Just really quick, a bizarre coincidence I just have to tell you. I actually worked at the church office building in the temple construction department, I think on the same floor as you, from about 2000 to 2004.
Yikes.
So we might have actually overlapped.
I'm certain we did.
And I actually got fired because I came in back. I used to sneak out at lunch and go dress up. And right after 9/11, when they really pumped up security, then I came back in still wearing a dress in my car, and the security cop followed me down. So I was going to go down to the parking garage and change.
We have things to talk about.
Just kind of a bizarre coincidence.
I can't tell you how many times, if I was leaving work in the middle of the day to go to my therapist appointment, how many times I changed clothes in the bathroom in that parking garage and left. I did the exact same thing you did. I left. It's not fair. And I was doing this way post 9/11, plenty of security cameras. I managed to get in, get out. Sorry. We'll have to compare stories. Okay, it's late. We should probably call it a night.
Thank you, Laurie Lee.
Thank you.